This afternoon we're going to talk about spiritual care of the elderly and also at the end of life. I think it'll be a very interesting talk, and this being almost the last talk in our series of spirituality and healthcare. It's our 12th talk, and next week we will look at creating a spiritual environment in a hospital setting or an office, and then the following week the psychology of religion and spirituality to finish this series which is taking place. Here's what I hope to cover. First of all, I want to look at the fact that becoming elderly is not all bad. And then I want to look at 4 tasks of all of us need to engage in, the living and the dying. We'll look at those one by one. There are many books that could inform spiritual care of the elderly. And at the end of life, the one in the center here by Christine Longaker is excellent. Facing Death and Finding Hope, a guide to the emotional and spiritual care of the dying. So I recommend it especially, although all of those I've shown have contributions. Harold Koenig and Doug Lawson have published this, written this book, compiled it, entitled Faith in the Future, Healthcare, Aging, and the Role of Religion. Covers many topics, as you see on the right there. At first, he addresses the challenge of our generation, which is that we're getting older and we have a larger population. The cost of healthcare is escalating. And then he looks at some solutions to this crisis, as he calls it, and particularly focuses on religion and how religion can be very important at the end of life and help in the process of this, what he calls the healthcare crisis. And then he also has looks at the role of caring communities that the aging and elderly would be a part of. So it's a very excellent book. And then this is another one entitled Aging as a Spiritual Practice. It's a contemplative approach to growing older and wiser, Lewis Richmond says, the author. And you can see what he covers in his book. He looks at elderhood, or the stages of aging, and says that we then need to, and he gives some reflections, he calls them contemplations on aging, including the science of healthy aging. He draws upon his interest in Buddhism, and then looks at a variety of things that help us contact the divine as we get older, and feels that is important. All of us have seen perhaps this sign on the road. You see the decrepit elderly people, and certainly aging can be a time of loss of purpose, as depicted by the man on the left, and loneliness and isolation, the lady at the bottom, and also debility, being disabled, needing others to help you even get across the street, and finally this agonizing depression that probably goes along with Alzheimer's in the man depicted at the bottom. And Vincent van Gogh in 1890 painted this grieving man at the end of life. It says, at eternity's gate. And perhaps many do find themselves in that place. But becoming older is not all bad. In fact, it can give us a time to use our wisdom and share it with others, like this older man with the younger man. It's a time to touch one another, be comfortable with that. You might not do that with a young person, but you can do it with older. And finally, there's this expectancy on the face of this man as he looks up. I love this hope that he has, maybe expectancy of what the future may hold after death. And finally, love. All of that can happen just as easily, or even sometimes more easily, as we get older. And today we're living longer, happier, more productive lives. These two men look pretty happy. We have time when we retire. We have time to do some of the things we never had time to do before, to read, to maybe do a woodcraft, or go on traveling to the mountaintops, talk to family and friends. But we're also more productive. Many people don't retire. They continue very active, productive lives, like, of course, the Pope, like Nelson Mandela, had an enormous impact in the latter part of his life, as well as did Einstein and Carl Sandburg, a poet, and Jim Baker in politics. And many of our politicians are quite elderly and yet very productive lives in the Senate and Congress of the United States and throughout the world. A recent study, in 2008, a study was done and published in the Proceeding of National Academy of Science, in which it was looking at the effect of happiness. And what they did, they looked at individuals from 18 to 85, over 340,000 individuals. They asked them a variety of questions to see where they were as far as their sense of well-being, and they were able to rank that. And then also they looked at a number of other questions they asked, like did you experience regularly in a large part of the day yesterday, did you experience enjoyment, happiness, stress, worry, anger, or sadness? And the results of the study were pretty good for older people. In fact, here's what they found. People start out at age 18 feeling pretty good about themselves, probably a little bit cocky, and then life begins to churn them under. They begin to feel worse and worse until about the age of 50, where there's a sharp reversal. People begin to get happier at that age and continue as the years pass after that. In fact, by the time they are 85, according to this study, they were more satisfied with themselves, happier with their life than they were when they were 18. So it's very hopeful and very interesting. So what kind of experiences make older people happier? Well, first of all, if they can just meet with someone, have a friendly conversation for 10 minutes, it not only decreases the sense of isolation, loneliness, and depression, it also increases their memory. In fact, all those memory tests that everybody has you doing, memory games, crossword puzzles. I'm very glad to be relieved of crossword puzzles. I've never been very good at it. But if you just have conversation for 10 minutes a day, it boosts memory and boosts sense of well-being, and so conversation is the principal one. Also, if we take the time to record our memories, families want to know what you experienced, what the elderly in their life have experienced. They can put them on a CD or a DVD and share their perspective. They've been through things like the war, depression, boom years after the war. What was that like? Launching careers, and all kinds of stories about raising their children. Put those in a collection is very important, and it's very rewarding both for the elderly but also for their families. And stay in touch with current events through television, through newspaper, and quite often elderly people don't do this. I had a very dear friend. She was 93 years old in Shreveport, Louisiana, my hometown. Very bright. She was the sheriff's mother. We got to know them quite well. And she was in a nursing home, and she said that the older people didn't really watch television. They weren't up on current events. This 93-year-old lady was very current on events, and she loved to have us come over or get with her so that she could talk to someone that was staying mentally alert and with it as far as what's happening today in life, and not just sitting in a nursing home. And, of course, hobbies. It's not just a way to pass time, but it's something that can cause us, when we wake up in the morning, to be excited about that day. And if we don't do this, sort of depression is very common. We don't have goals. We don't have anything to anticipate. And as they say, it's never too late to take up an activity that you've always wanted to do. If that's true, I may have to take up piano because I always wanted to do that. What kind of hobbies? Can be almost anything. Collections of all sorts. It can be learning to watercolor, oil paint. Could be gardening or indoor house plants, raising indoor plants. There's a lady in my church setting. If you go to her house, what she will do is, after our conversation, go over into the back garden area it's an enclosed area in her house, and she'll give you either an orchid or some other plant. You're not going to leave without one, and it's her way of doing things. And you think of her then every day after you get to your home looking at the plant. Bird watching, you can do it in your backyard. Put a bird bath there and start watching. Woodworking, some people do that, particularly if they've been good with their hands. I would love to do that. That's something I would like to do. Developing a family recipe book. You may have wonderful recipes that the family loved over the years, but they're going to be gone if you don't record them, put them in a book. And finally, caring for a pet. A dog is man's best friend, they say, and cats might be as well. I don't know about cats, but dogs are. And then you might even want to skydive, like our president, George H.W. Bush, did when he was 85 years of age. And I saw him recently, and I told him, I said, President Bush, you really encouraged me at my age that as I get older, I don't have to worry. I can skydive if I want to. And he said, at your age, John, you're just a spring chicken. And he's a great guy, and I think encourage a lot of people that you can do some unusual things even as you get older. The point being is being elderly can be a good experience. As we grow older, we'll have more time. And if our time is well spent, we can experience happiness perhaps greater than we even did earlier in our life. By the way, in that study it said at age 50, there was a dramatic change, and then the sense of well-being grew from that point on for the rest of the life. I think that's because the kids are out of the house. I think that's why we would suddenly get happier. Okay, we all have a sense of well-being, of a life. If we do these things, we'll have a sense of well-being, of a life well lived. And we're even likelier to be happier than our teenage grandkids or middle-aged grandchildren. I want to just remind us not to forget our faith. The elderly have time to pray and worship, not only privately but corporately. They can read the sacred scriptures and draw closer to God as they really begin to have a growing sense of expectation of one day their ultimate union with God. By the way, this picture over here of this elderly man, this picture of the elderly man almost looks like my father. I have interesting memories. My dad was old enough to be my grandfather. And I saw him at the table in our kitchen, sitting there reading scriptures, praying, and he looked almost identical to that. That's why I picked that picture. When the elderly are asked what are the sources of strength and joy in their life, many of them are going to tell you it's religion. Ranks very high. Both corporate gatherings where they attend religious services, worship with others, sing the hymns of the faith, which they love to do, or privately where they read scriptures, the Bible, the Quran, or the Gita, and privately prayer, meditation, and then home visitation by clergy, relatives, and friends. All of that, I'm talking about religious friends that come in and pray with them, hold their hand, very meaningful. Studies have shown that religious involvement is related to better health and a greater sense of well-being among the elderly. Duke University, under Harold Koenig, in 1993 began a longitudinal study that examined the relationships of religious affiliation and religious attendance, and also how often the person came to the hospital for care. They looked at 542 medical patients who had an average age of 70. And in their study, the findings reveal the probability of being hospitalized in a previous year was 44% lower for those who attended religious services at least once a week. 44% lower than those who attended religious services less frequently. In other words, the frequent attendance of religious services also in this study had a shorter hospital stay. Not only were they less likely to go to the hospital, if they did, the stay was shorter. And those who had no religious affiliation spent an average of 14 days more in the hospital in that previous year than did the frequent attenders. So as far as health is concerned, religion is vital and important and can even be proven statistically. Helping people, the elderly particularly, being healthy and well, there are now probably over 10,000 parish or congregational nurses in churches and synagogues and other religious organizations in America. And in addition to what they do are things like wellness screening, like they'll have an event in which your blood pressure will be checked, they'll draw blood for your glucose, and in the past they would do the prostate studies, the PSA, and look at the person and see how they're doing. But the role is also bigger than just having those screening events. They educate the congregation, including the elderly, as far as preventative medicine. They arrange seminars, bring in doctors, bring in nurses to talk about nutrition, exercise, weight management, overcoming addictions, and safe sexual practices. There are 7 responsibilities of a parish nurse, and certainly one of the important roles they do is integrate faith and health and help individuals in a church setting or congregational setting integrate their faith in, as well as be advisors, educators for health. They're counselors. They refer people to this agency or this doctor. They coordinate volunteer support groups. They create support groups, like a grief support group or another group for, say, men who have prostate cancer, women who have been through breast cancer. And they serve as a health advocate for parishioners in a hospital setting. So they really have an important role, and Harold Koenig has this schematic drawing which he shows to show the prevention and management of diseases. And in his picture here, he shows the important role of clergy who motivate this. This is the larger community, volunteers who run health programs, take blood pressures, blood sugars, coordinate services, and then this parish nurse, or it could be a lay leader, and have a physician advisor. And then finally, of course, if the patient needs it, or parishioner needs it, they would wind up in an acute care hospital or a nursing home or outpatient facility. So Harold Koenig says this is an important thing in a church or a religious setting. Having a parish nurse or lay leader can be a very key person to maintaining good health as people get older and older. And as we all know, generally speaking, 80% of the cost of health care is in the last 6 months of life. So if we can keep people healthier, not only is the cost of health care going to be less, they will live a healthier and happier life. Having said all that, that's about what it's like to gradually go older and older and be elderly. But the fact is, we will all eventually face the end of life, and we'll all die. And this is a lovely picture of a lady right at the end of life, but she's being well cared for by a nurse who has a beautiful smile. Christina Longaker has written an excellent book entitled the title of her book is Facing Death and Finding Hope. I showed you a picture of it earlier. In that book, she has a major section called 4 Tasks of Living and Dying. And I want to use her little framework. I'll put my own stuff in there as well as some of hers, but I want to look at these 4 tasks. First of all, she says, 4 tasks of living and dying is understanding and transforming suffering. Secondly, making a connection, healing relationships, and then letting go at the end of life is important. She talks about being prepared spiritually for death. And then finally, the overall finding meaning in life is vitally important for both the living and the dying. So I want to look at those areas. We have talked about suffering in the previous lectures. I want to just review a little of that. First of all, not all pain causes suffering, and not all suffering causes pain. In fact, there are many causes of suffering in the elderly, especially not just pain, and could be a serious illness like cancer, but also simply retirement, loss of status, place, and activity, loss of people coming to you, asking your advice, the existential suffering of loneliness, lack of meaning and purpose in life, maybe looking back on your life and thinking it's negative, what in the world happened in my life? So it's over so quickly. The fear of death itself and what will life hold after death, or is there life after death? And then finally, spiritual matters such as, am I good enough? Will God accept me? Will I go to heaven or will I not? We saw also under suffering there were 4 areas, levels, if you will, with each patient who's suffering in a hospital. First of all, there are their biomedical problems, the process of dying. On an individual level, their halt to personal plans, hopes, futures they might have had, even at the end of life. Relational level, how is their spouse, children, and loved ones being affected? And finally, the ultimate concern level, spiritual suffering. And by asking open-ended questions that address each of those 4 levels, we can invite a patient to share a deeper, perhaps their deeper cause of suffering. We may think they're just anxious, when in fact they have a spiritual concern that needs to be addressed. And the way we address compassionately patients who are suffering, we do it in at least 3 ways. First of all, we sympathize with them. We recognize they are suffering. We respond with feelings of genuine empathy, understanding, words. And then we're moved to take actions. And the actions can be as simple as holding their hand. It could be as simple as saying a kind word. But we do something. We take an action ourselves. Spirituality fills the compassionate response that I've just enumerated and can transform suffering. In this idea of transforming suffering, I want to mention also attributed values. All of us, as we grow older, we are attributed certain values by our culture. We get degrees from our universities. We get position and title at work. We're recognized perhaps for our intelligence or artistic ability, maybe for our humor. And then we also have intrinsic value, which is about our being, not our doings, the things we've done, but who we are, the fact that we're human, and therefore related to God, a transcendent God. And when we become elderly and retire, we lose our attributed values one by one. It can be very painful. The degree you have on the wall means nothing any longer. Nobody's coming to talk to you, to ask questions, get your wisdom, to acknowledge that you're a wise person. But we may lose the attributive values, but we never lose these intrinsic values as a person created in the image of God, loved by God. And I believe this is vitally important to be able to know as a healthcare giver, because we can always share the love of God has for the patient at the end of life, and that is something every healthcare giver can do and should be able to do. So healthcare givers can be instrumental in transforming suffering of the elderly. And that process of transformation, I'll repeat, is acknowledging the reality of their suffering, not ignoring it, acknowledging it, giving expression of empathy and compassion, and really remaining available and present for the patient, not abandoning the patient. So often family, relatives, they think, they may think that the individual who's near the end of life and death may not even be with it, so they don't feel they can communicate well. But it's extremely important to be available and present for the patient. And finally, let the patient know that he or she still has that intrinsic value and meaning that comes to her from a relationship with God, even in the midst of illness, fears, and the end of life. Suffering is transformed by compassion, and compassion can touch the suffering of another person. Well, that's the first task. The first task is to address suffering, according to Christina Longaker. The second task is to make a genuine connection with the patient. At the time in their life when an elderly person is most vulnerable, suffering, and soon will face death, they need not only the best of medical care, they also need to be comforted, they need reassurance, they need affection and love. That's vitally important, but all too often they get just the opposite. Hospital staff and family disappears, they don't communicate with the patient as they would in the past, and they don't give comfort, reassurance, or affection. So the healthcare professional who's alert to this should be aware and then can provide that for the patient, can provide comfort, a touch, can provide reassurance. All is going to be well. Give affection and compassionate love expressions that the patient needs. Come bounding in the room with joy and let them know that you are you're happy to be there and be with them. The second thing about genuine connection with someone is that there are certain qualities. There's a quality of openness to communicate without expectations and truly listen in order to truly get to know the person. And realize that connection can be a holy or sacred moment. And if it is a holy or sacred moment, you'll know it. You'll feel it. You'll feel it in your being. And then have a willingness to share as appropriate your own self. Let that person know you're a real person, not just a nurse, not just a doctor, not just someone who happens to be visiting in the room to do a technical study or something. Let them know that you are human as well. And when we make a genuine connection, we really only have to be very natural, speak from our heart, nothing forced, nothing ritualized so that you do exactly the same thing in every room. Instead, with every patient, instead be natural for this patient, the one you've gotten to know and you've listened to. If you do that, there will be experiences of the sacred moment. And when you have that sacred moment, you will leave and drive home in your car feeling blessed to have been at work that day. Christina Longaker gives a list of things that she says are the needs of the dying. And she wrote it as if she were the dying person. She dealt with a dying mother closely for years. So she wrote these statements of what a dying person needs from us. And I thought they were interesting. First of all, a statement is, I want you to see me as a whole person, not as a disease or a tragedy or as a fragile blade of grass. And don't look on me with pity, but rather look on me with all of your love and compassion. Even if I'm facing death, I'm still alive. Interesting. I want people to treat me normally, include me in their lives, tell me what's happening. Don't think you cannot be completely open and honest with me. More than anything, I need you to be honest. And I think that's something we sometimes, I know many people go into the room of somebody that's dying, and what they do, they try to change the subject. They don't address with honesty what is actually they're maybe going through. And it leaves them feeling like, don't you know where I am? Don't you know what's happening to me? Another statement, it won't help if you try to give me your own beliefs and answers about death. I need you to help me discover my own beliefs, my own philosophy, my own inner resources. I think that's really key. Each person already has within themselves an understanding about death and life after death. It's their understanding. They acquired, if they're elderly, they acquired it over a long period of time. They don't need to hear our beliefs. They need to be able to verbalize or articulate their own beliefs and put them so it becomes a resource, a strength. And then this statement, but if you happen to be grounded in a spiritual tradition which gives you strength, which helps you work through your own suffering, perhaps you can find ways to open windows and doors of hope for me, is one thing the person needs when they're dying, that you could open it up your own self. And perhaps all you need to do is tell me your own story without any expectations attached. With time, if you give me your love and your trust, I will work something out deep inside me. So that's letting the elderly, the person facing death, discover themselves in a deeper way. And you telling your story may trigger something from their past that they've even forgotten. Maybe from ancient past, maybe from their childhood, that will help them work through it and, in fact, bless them. The third task, more about that, preparing spiritually for death, according to Christina Longaker. All of our religious traditions say it's important to prepare spiritually for death. And not later, not at the end of life, but right now. And if we prepared daily spiritual practices now, then they will come to bless us later. So developing a consistent spiritual set of practices becomes ingrained in us, part of the fabric of our being, body, soul, and spirit, who we are, and we can draw on them. They will allow us to respond appropriately throughout life. And when we experience tragedy, loss, suffering, and face death, those practices will be a blessing and will enrich our lives. We can draw on them. So it's the task number 3 is to prepare spiritually for death. And the fact is, people usually die the way they live. Yet it is possible that a person facing death can change their attitudes, the course of their life. Those who face death can use their latter days to review their past life. They can plan for days that are remaining. They can engage in practices of piety as needed. In other words, when they review their past, they may say, I need to bring the priest in, I need to confess my sins. They may heal relationships that are broken. Reviewing the past, they realize that. They may send out a word, I need to talk to so-and-so. Many do this. And they can, with that preparation, they can look expectantly and hopefully to life after death. So as healthcare professionals, we should seek to understand the dying person's spiritual beliefs, offer reassurance with words that support whatever it is they believe or what they're thinking, not try to counter it, and being careful at the same time not to share our own beliefs. So the key is to listen to the patient, respect his or her way of thinking, wishes, and needs, and then ask the patient to tell you about his life or her life. And while you're listening to that story, look for the best qualities in their life story and acknowledge them. Say, well, it sounds like to me you really have blessed many people in your life. And the truth is, they will probably minimalize it. They will probably say, well, no, I didn't do anything. But you can reinforce, no, you really were there. I heard you. You were there for that person. So it's very important that a healthcare giver be able to do that and take the time to do it. Also, task 3, a person who has faith in their religion may view death in a positive way, seeing it as an opportunity when I die, I'll become one with God. But that's not always the case. Others may experience difficulty, particularly if they feel God is distant and unknowable because of some spiritual distress they have. So it would be nice to be able to discern this and understand it, and maybe encourage that person. Would you like to have a visit with a chaplain or a pastor? And you could arrange it. And these people may be very uncertain about how to prepare for God's kingdom, how to prepare their hearts to see God in their minds. And being aware of their weakness and failings, they may even think that they wonder if God will forgive them. They may feel, I've done the unpardonable sin. I've heard that. And they feel unforgivable. Others may not know how to let go and die to reach their ultimate goal, which is union with God. They may need help to say it's okay to let go. It's okay to embrace what God has for you on the other side. You can word those things in a way they'll appreciate it. If a person faces death, professes belief in God, but has left their own religion due to either a dogmatic, some conflict with dogma, or a church split, which is very often the case, a healthcare caregiver can encourage that person, don't focus on that. Don't focus on those problems. Instead, focus on that which represents the deepest part of your faith. Your devotional practices. Read Scripture. The sacred writings of your faith. Pray. Receive Holy Communion if that would be a blessing to you. Express love to God and others. Visit with a clergy or chaplain if you like, and visit with someone from your religious community, either friends who you know to have the same beliefs and understandings you do. So part of our task in dying is to find a way to make our peace with God, confess our mistakes, clear our soul. And we do that by asking for and being willing to receive God's unconditional love and forgiveness. And if the person feels unforgivable, we can encourage that person to think about the fact of God's mercy and of God's love. In the Islamic tradition, God is merciful. Emphasize that. In the Christian and Judeo-Christian tradition, you may reflect on stories in the Bible, those individuals who sinned grievously and were forgiven in Scripture, like King David committed adultery and caused the murder of Bathsheba's husband, or the Apostle Paul, who cast Christians into prison and said he was the worst of sinners, yet he was forgiven, or the beautiful story of the prodigal son that Jesus told in the Gospels, who squandered his father's wealth, yet was forgiven and embraced by his father when he returned home. Those stories can help us connect with God, who is merciful and loving and who will receive us and forgive us. Well, what if a person faces death, does not have any, or tells you they have no formal prayers, no relationship to rituals religious rituals they could rely on? The healthcare giver in that case can encourage the person to pray in their own words, encouraging them to pray from their heart, and then also tell them to be absolutely honest. Tell God whatever you want to without worry of offending God. Tell them God already knows what you're thinking, so God can take it. God's big enough to take it. It may encourage them to open up and really have that opportunity near the end of life. And as this priestly reassurance is mentioned, a priest would say at the time of death, every person is given a chance to make peace with God. Here's a simple prayer that anyone might pray. Dear God, thank you for the life you have given me to live. I ask you to be with me at the moment of my death, to give me the courage to let go. Forgive me of all of my sins, and make me ready to be with you. Amen. It's a beautiful, simple little prayer that anyone can pray at the end of life, and You know, a health care giver could even, if assuming that you've asked the patient, would you like me to help you with the prayer, you might pray, help them pray something like that. And the fourth task, according to Christina Longaker, is finding meaning in life. In Tolstoy's book, The Death of Ivan Ilyich, he writes, the very first sentence, Ivan Ilyich's physical sufferings were terrible, but worse than his physical sufferings were his mental sufferings, which were his chief torture. His mental sufferings were due to the fact that the question suddenly occurred to him, what if my whole life had really been wrong? But if that is so, he said to himself, and I am leaving this life with a consciousness that I've lost all that was given to me, and it is impossible to rectify it, what then? I'll tell you what, there are many people that have that experience at the end of their life. They wonder, what does their life mean? Did I make a difference? Why was I here on this planet anyway? And did I do what God wanted me to do? The fact is, talking about meaning in life, very few of us have done extraordinary things. We've not been a Mother Teresa, Albert Schweitzer, we've not been a Gandhi, we have not been Martin Luther King Jr. We haven't even made a name for ourselves as an entertainer, artist, craftsman, or religious leader. So some will say my life was utterly meaningless. Reviewing one's life is important, though. Many realize they were preoccupied with material gain. They have painful memories of the choices they made. Or they may realize how they were selfish, unkind, disrespectful to others, particularly their own loved ones. They may have been mean-spirited. Very sobering thing. You would think, well, it'd be at the end of my life, it'd be good I didn't review my life if that was the case. But the fact is, we need to do it. It's very important. We need to do it throughout our life. We need to have moments in which we stop and reflect on our life and modify our behavior where necessary. I think we must do these reviews, even if it causes anguish, and momentarily we feel pain, because they can be the transformative thing in our life. Realizing our whole life was not what it should have been can be distressing. But even at the end of life, we can ask for forgiveness, both from God and those we've hurt. We can seek to repair broken relationships. We can extend forgiveness and compassion to those we've hurt and to those who've offended us in the past. We can realize stuff was going on in their life which made them be mean-spirited towards us. And being compassionate, we can release them and let them go. Very important. We never truly face ourselves, probably, though, until we face death. If we could gaze in a mirror of death today, all of us, we would probably be encouraged to transform our lives and make them better. And those who do know that their time is limited, and they often change their priorities and spiritual commitments to reflect what they want to be their true values. By the way, I've said it before, but most people say, I want to fall asleep, I want to die in my sleep. Just lay down and die. Or I want to drop dead one day. They don't want to face death itself. They're afraid of it, I guess. But the fact is, it leaves a family without ever having been able to say goodbye. And I have personally found in church settings that individuals who go through many months of cancer treatment, they find that it's a great opportunity to restore relationships that were broken, and they are grateful for those months of time, even knowing that they soon may die. There are also many who have died and returned after a near-death experience. I don't know what you think about it. I just want to address it. And they return feeling challenged afterwards to change their priorities in life and the way they relate to others. There's a book that I've recently read entitled Into the Light by John Lermer, a physician. He was medical director of Texas Medical Center Hospice, and he compiled about 15 stories and has told in that book an account of God's love for everyone, as told by a 9-year-old boy who was dying, of a murderer who saw an angelic being in light and was changed, a young woman who was a drug user. Actually, she had been a drug user. She came to a life-transforming relationship with God, and then she got an illness that the doctor put her on drugs, and she wound up back in abusing drugs and struggled with God. Why did God let this happen? She came to a good relationship with God. She even was a singer with a worship group. And yet she came to the end of her life and was able to work through this and was able to let go and let God at the end of her life. Very interesting story. A fundamental minister who had strong attitudes against homosexuality. And he also didn't like Joel Osteen because he thought his gospel preaching wasn't good. He had an angelic visitor who told him that love was the bottom line of everything. And he came to the place that he could change his attitudes towards homosexuality, at least not being judgmental, and he was also able, in fact, to say that Joel Osteen was preaching what people need to hear today. They don't need to hear, you're a sinner and you're going to hell, which he had been preaching. Instead, they need to hear God loves you and has a plan for your life and a future destiny with him. Also, he told about an angel who saw angelic beings in light, and a German Nazi SS officer who was not able to forgive himself after the Second World War. He had a picture of a young, beautiful Jewish woman look him in the face with no judgment as he sent her to her certain death in the gas chamber. It was a haunting memory he had. He could not forget it. And then at this end of his life setting, as he began to talk to Dr. Lermer, and they began to talk, in due season, he had a vision of this same woman. And what she said to him, he recognized her immediately. She said, I forgave you before you caused my death. And he was able to forgive himself and recognize the love that this woman had, the power of it in his life. Dr. Lermer says this, they all speak of the one God that creates with total love, forever reminding us that everyone on this planet serves a purpose and is united with the same wholeness, a wholeness that will in due time create universal and eternal peace and love. I found the book interesting. You can judge it yourself, but I found it very interesting. And I just, in case you don't want to believe these kind of stories, I just want to tell you, you may appreciate Jane Seymour. You may need to have a celebrity. Jane Seymour had an allergic reaction to penicillin. And she, indeed, here's her story. She said, I literally left my body. You've heard these stories, but Jane Seymour, I don't think, would tell this. It wasn't what she experienced. I had this feeling that I could see myself in bed and people were grouped all around me. I remember them all trying to resuscitate me. I was above them in the corner of the room looking down. I saw people putting needles in me and trying to hold me down, doing things. I remember my whole life flashing before my eyes. But I wasn't thinking about winning Emmys, she said. The only thing I cared about was that I wanted to live because I did not want anyone else caring for my children. I was floating up there thinking, no, I don't want to die. I'm not ready to leave my kids. And then she said, and that was when I said to God, if you're there, God, if you really exist and I survive, she made a little agreement with God, I will never take your name in vain again. She says, I believe that I died for about 30 seconds. I can remember pleading with the doctor to bring me back. I was determined I wasn't going to die. Gary Busey is said to be the bad boy of Hollywood. That was his nickname by his wife at the time. He had a motorcycle, got on it at the shop. He did not wear a helmet, was slid in a gravel just 100 feet from the shop at 40 miles an hour, and his head struck the curb, causing a fracture of his skull. He became unconscious for about 30 days, I believe, if I remember right, and he came closer to dying than he ever had before. While on the operating table for brain surgery, he had a near-death experience, he says, and he said, "I saw angels. I was surrounded by angels, and they don't look anything like they do on Christmas cards. They're big balls of light that float and carry nothing but love and warmth." Interesting. And then also I just want to mention Donald Sutherland. He had meningitis in 1979. His body shut down. He died before being resuscitated back to life. And when he came to, he said this: "Suddenly the pain, the fever, the acute distress seemed to evaporate. I was floating above my body, surrounded by soft blue light. I began to glide down a long tunnel away from the bed, and suddenly I found myself back in my body. And the doctors told me later that I'd actually died for a time." So in case you can't believe Dr. Lermer's book, maybe you can accept these celebrity stories. So what does all this mean? To me, it means that all of life is a gift from a loving God. Humans are created in the image of God, are loved unconditionally, even when we are in the midst of doing something wrong, and we know we're doing it wrong. God still loves us and will embrace us. For me, life does not end at the grave. We will experience eternal life with God and all of the heavenly hosts, and that is, including all who've died and gone before, and angelic beings. And I believe people from every tribe and kindred, every religion, even those who profess to be atheists and agnostic, will be there with us. And this can be a comforting thought, I believe, to those who are near the end of life. They can feel confident of God's love, look with expectancy to eternal life with God and the people of God. And I believe healthcare professionals should work through this kind of understanding themselves. They may not want to believe what I believe, but they should be prepared with some way to comfort their patients who are at the end of life. And a simple word from your heart can do that. I want to close with this story. This story is found in Robert Bella's book, Religion and Human Evolution. And he tells of a pastor of an urban California congregation who relates this story. A woman's mother was near death, but she didn't have a church home. A neighbor gave her my name, and I visited her. At the door, the woman said, "I don't know why I called you, but my mother is near death, and I thought maybe we should have someone from the church here." He says, "When we talked, I found out that the mother and daughter had been involved in church in the past. I suggested we go into the mother's room to pray, and she said no, that our mother had been in a coma for days and would not be able to participate. But the pastor urged her, let's go in the room anyway. He said he offered a prayer and then asked her to join him in the Lord's Prayer. And he says, we had barely begun to say, Our Father who art in heaven, when the comatose mother joined us with the rest of the prayer. She came out of her coma, and for a few days before she died, mother and daughter had a significant conversation." This is the power, I think, of prayer, but it's not just that. What it is this prayer was in the heart of this woman who was semi-conscious at least, and just hearing those words awakened her, and she and her daughter could have several very meaningful days at the end of life. I think we need to realize that life and death are part of the human picture, and we can enrich our lives while we're living. We can enrich that experience of death as well. So I think we've covered a good bit of what it means to engage in spiritual care of the elderly and those who are at the end of life. Next week, we will look at creating a spiritual environment in the hospital. I welcome you to listen in and be here. Thank you.